In your entire career spanning 4 decades in public life, can you name a single time when something went wrong and you said, "This was my fault and I'm sorry"? That question, 14 seconds of silence, 28 million Americans watching, and Hillary Clinton, the most powerful woman in Democratic politics, couldn't answer it. Tonight you're going to watch Tulsi Gabbard do something no one in Washington has ever dared: hold Hillary Clinton accountable for Benghazi, for the emails, for the Clinton Foundation's $145 million from Uranium One, for 40 years of "it's never my fault." When Hillary called her a Russian asset, she thought she was ending Tulsi's career. Instead, she started her own political execution. Hillary Clinton entered CNN's studio like she'd entered every room for 40 years, like she owned it. She had a plan to destroy Tulsi Gabbard on live television, call her a Russian asset, end her nomination before it began, return to business as usual. Congresswoman Gabbard's positions have been remarkably consistent with Russian interests. Hillary began her voice dripping with practiced authority. The Russians couldn't have asked for a better asset in the intelligence community. The Democratic audience applauded. Liberal Twitter celebrated. MSNBC prepared their victory clips. Then Tulsi Gabbard smiled, not the defensive smile of someone under attack, the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Thank you, Secretary Clinton. The American people do deserve the truth about their leaders." A pause. About all of their leaders. Hillary's confident smirk began to fade. "You've questioned my fitness to handle America's secrets, so let's examine your record with America's secrets. Let's start with Benghazi and why you lied to the families of 4 dead Americans." Secretary Clinton, in your entire career, spanning 4 decades in public life, can you name a single time when something went wrong and you took responsibility? A single time when you said, "This was my fault and I'm sorry"? The silence that followed Tulsi Gabbard's question lasted exactly 14 seconds. 14 seconds that felt like an eternity. 14 seconds during which 28 million Americans watched Hillary Clinton, the most powerful woman in Democratic politics, open her mouth, then close it, then look away in defeat. In 30 years of television, I've never seen anyone dare to challenge Hillary Clinton like this, and certainly never seen her destroyed so completely. Anderson Cooper's voice carried across the CNN newsroom with an unusual tremor of both excitement and shock. The silver-haired anchor stood before the breaking news desk, his usually composed demeanor betraying the magnitude of what had just transpired in Studio 7B. Behind him, producers frantically coordinated with graphics teams while social media metrics exploded across multiple monitors in ways they'd never seen before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just witnessed one of the most brutal political confrontations in television history." Cooper continued, his piercing blue eyes fixed on camera one. What began as Hillary Clinton's calculated attack on Tulsi Gabbard became something entirely different: a systematic destruction of the Clinton legacy and, frankly, the Democratic establishment itself. The control room buzzed with controlled chaos. Director Sarah Chen barked orders into her headset while keeping one eye on the trending hashtags climbing the screen: #Clinton destroyed, Tulsi, truth, Democratic meltdown, or CNN showdown. Within 15 minutes, the confrontation had generated more social media engagement than any political program in television history, and 73% of it was celebrating Hillary Clinton's downfall. "I've covered politics for 3 decades, Cooper continued, "but I've never seen a political figure so thoroughly dismantled using nothing but facts and moral authority. What you're about to see isn't just the end of Hillary Clinton's career. It's the end of an entire era of Democratic Party corruption. But to understand what had just unfolded, we need to go back to where it all began, 90 minutes earlier, when America tuned in expecting a routine political discussion and instead got a reckoning that would reshape American politics forever." February 15, 2025, 8:47 p.m. EST. The CNN studio had been transformed into something resembling a modern Roman amphitheater. 200 carefully selected audience members, A mix of foreign policy experts, military veterans, intelligence professionals, Democratic Party loyalists, and engaged citizens filled the tiered seating that curved around a central stage. The lighting was dramatic but professional, designed to convey the gravity of national security discussions while maintaining the intimacy that made for compelling television. What CNN's producers didn't anticipate was that they were constructing a coliseum where one of America's most powerful political figures would meet her final defeat. Good evening. I'm Anderson Cooper, and welcome to this CNN primetime special, America's Intelligence Future. Cooper began from his position at the moderator's desk. Tonight we're examining one of the most critical appointments of the new administration, the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. The introduction had been meticulously planned. CNN's promotional campaign had promised an unprecedented discussion about national security featuring diverse perspectives from experienced voices. Bye! Liberal media outlets had been buzzing all day about Hillary Clinton's appearance, with MSNBC's Rachel Maddow tweeting, "Finally someone with the experience and courage to ask the tough questions about this dangerous nomination." What they hadn't advertised was the powder keg they'd inadvertently constructed, a live television format where truth could triumph over political calculation, where facts could overcome narrative, where authentic service could defeat decades of corruption. Joining us tonight are two women who've shaped American foreign policy in very different ways. Cooper continued, his voice carrying the practiced authority that had made him one of television's most trusted anchors. First, we welcome former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, whose 4 years leading American diplomacy under President Obama included navigating some of the most complex international challenges in recent history. The camera panned to Hillary Clinton, seated in one of two leather chairs positioned at a slight angle to encourage conversation. She wore a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse, her blonde hair styled in her signature bob. Her smile was practiced political, the expression of someone who'd sat for thousands of interviews over 3 decades in public life. Behind her, in the front row of the audience, sat a carefully curated collection of Democratic establishment figures, former Obama administration officials, Clinton Foundation donors, liberal professors, and MSNBC contributors, all there to provide moral support for what they expected to be Hillary's triumphant destruction of Trump's controversial nominee. "Secretary Clinton, thank you for being here," Cooper said. "Thank you for having me, Anderson. These are critical times, and I believe the American people deserve a thorough discussion about who we entrust with our nation's most sensitive intelligence." Her voice carried that familiar tone of moral authority that had served her well for decades, the implication that she alone possessed the wisdom and experience to judge others' fitness for office. Little did she know that within the next hour that very authority would be shredded beyond repair. And joining Secretary Clinton is Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, President-elect Trump's nominee for Director of National Intelligence. Congresswoman Gabbard served 4 terms representing Hawaii in the House and brings a unique perspective as a combat veteran who deployed to Iraq and Kuwait. The camera shifted to Tulsi Gabbard, seated across from Clinton with the kind of perfect posture that spoke to military training. At 44, she projected a calm confidence that contrasted sharply with the political theater that usually dominated such programs. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, and she wore a charcoal gray suit that suggested seriousness without ostentation. Unlike Hillary's section of the audience, Tulsi's supporters were scattered throughout. Veterans in uniform, intelligence professionals, and independent voters who'd grown tired of traditional politicians. "Congresswoman, thank you for joining us." "Thank you, Anderson. I'm honored to be here to discuss how we can best serve the American people and protect our national security." In the CNN control room, Director Sarah Chen noticed something the home audience couldn't see: the way Hillary Clinton's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly when Gabbard spoke, and how several Democratic audience members had already begun recording on their phones, expecting to capture Tulsi's destruction for social media. 20 years of directing political programs had taught Chen to recognize the micro-expressions that preceded fireworks. "This should be interesting," she murmured into her headset. She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The first 20 minutes proceeded exactly as CNN's producers had scripted. Cooper asked measured questions about intelligence community reform, the challenges of coordinating between agencies, and the evolving nature of national security threats. Both women provided thoughtful, if predictable, responses that would have satisfied any focus group. Hillary Clinton spoke with the authority of experience, referencing her time in the Situation Room during the bin Laden raid and her work rebuilding relationships with allies. "The intelligence community requires steady leadership," she said. "Someone who understands not just the technical aspects of intelligence gathering, but the delicate diplomatic relationships that make that intelligence actionable." Democratic audience members nodded approvingly. On Twitter, liberal blue checkmarks were already preparing their victory lap tweets. "This is what real experience looks like," and "Hillary schooling the Russian asset." Tulsi Gabbard responded by emphasizing her military background and her service on the House Armed Services Committee. "Having served in uniform and seen firsthand the consequences of intelligence failures, I understand both the critical importance of getting it right and the human cost when we don't." The audience remained attentive but relaxed. Social media engagement was steady but unremarkable. In living rooms across America, viewers were beginning to reach for their phones, expecting another predictable political discussion. Then Anderson Cooper asked the question that would change everything. Secretary Clinton, some critics have raised concerns about Congresswoman Gabbard's foreign policy positions, particularly her 2017 meeting with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. As someone who's dealt extensively with authoritarian regimes, what's your assessment of how the intelligence community should approach such situations? It was meant to be a softball, an opportunity for Clinton to discuss diplomatic nuance while giving Gabbard a chance to explain her position. Instead, it was the match that lit the fuse that would detonate 3 decades of Democratic Party corruption on live television. Hillary Clinton's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes, something predatory and confident. She leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a steel that hadn't been there moments before. "Anderson, that's exactly the kind of question that concerns me about this nomination." The trap was set. The Democratic establishment was about to get the reckoning it never saw coming. Hillary Clinton had been in politics long enough to know that the most effective attacks began with the appearance of reluctance. She paused as if carefully considering her words, then continued with the practiced delivery of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of character assassination. "Let me be clear, I don't take any pleasure in raising these concerns. I have tremendous respect for Congresswoman Gabbard's military service and her dedication to public service, but the American people deserve to understand the full picture when it comes to such a critical position." The audience had gone completely still. Even the most politically naive viewers could sense the shift in atmosphere. In the control room, Sarah Chen felt her pulse quicken as she watched the camera feeds. This was no longer a discussion. It was becoming an execution. At least that's what Hillary Clinton thought. Democratic establishment figures in the audience leaned forward with anticipation. Former Obama officials exchanged knowing glances. Clinton Foundation donors smiled with satisfaction. Liberal journalists began crafting their post-show analysis about how Hillary had taken down the Trump nominee. "Anderson, when I served as Secretary of State, I learned that our adversaries are constantly looking for ways to influence American policy. They're sophisticated, patient, and they understand that the most effective influence isn't always direct. Sometimes it works through people who may not even realize they're being used." MSNBC producers in the control room were already texting their hosts about featuring this exchange on tomorrow's programs. Rachel Maddow's team began preparing graphics about Russian influence operations. The liberal media ecosystem was gearing up for what they expected would be a complete vindication of their narrative about Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard's expression remained impassive, but her posture had straightened imperceptibly. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but those who knew military bearing could see the subtle signs of someone preparing for combat. Hillary continued her tone, remaining conversational even as the words grew sharper. "The intelligence community has expressed serious concerns about some of the positions Congresswoman Gabbard has taken over the years. Her willingness to meet with dictators like Assad, her consistent opposition to American leadership abroad, her strange tendency to echo talking points that seem to come straight from Russian state media. Secretary Clinton, Cooper interjected, sensing the conversation careening away from his carefully planned format. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that when someone's foreign policy positions consistently align with those of our adversaries, when they show more sympathy for dictators than for our democratic allies, when they've been promoted by Russian state media and amplified by their bot networks, we have to ask serious questions. The camera caught something remarkable in that moment, Tulsi Gabbard's slight smile. Not one of amusement, but the kind of expression a chess grandmaster might wear when recognizing that their opponent has just made a fatal error. She remained silent, letting Hillary continue to build what would become her own gallows. Liberal Twitter was exploding with excitement. Russian asset began trending within seconds. Democratic operatives were already cutting clips for campaign ads. CNN's Jim Acosta tweeted, "Finally someone with the courage to speak truth about this dangerous nomination. This isn't personal, Anderson. This is about national security. The Director of National Intelligence has access to our most sensitive secrets. They coordinate with allies who have trusted us with their most valuable intelligence. Can we really afford to put someone in that position who has such a troubling pattern of judgment when it comes to our adversaries?" What Hillary Clinton didn't realize was that she had just walked into a trap of her own making, one baited with 30 years of her own scandals, corruption, and lies. Hillary Clinton had been building toward this moment since she'd agreed to appear on the program. The audience was completely focused now, social media was beginning to explode, and she had the floor. It was time to deploy what she believed would be her most devastating weapon. Anderson. I've been watching Congresswoman Gabbard's career for some time now, and I have to say, the Russians couldn't have asked for a better asset in the intelligence community. The word hung in the air like a live grenade. Asset. Not just criticism of policy positions or judgment, but the direct suggestion of something approaching treason. Democratic audience members burst into applause. Former Clinton staffers nodded approvingly. Liberal professors smiled with satisfaction. The Democratic establishment was certain they were witnessing the destruction of Trump's nominee. In 2017, she traveled to Syria and met with Bashar al-Assad, a man who has used chemical weapons against his own people, a war criminal supported by Vladimir Putin. She didn't go through official channels. She didn't coordinate with the State Department. She simply decided on her own to give international legitimacy to one of the world's most brutal dictators. Tulsi's smile had faded, replaced by the kind of focused attention that predators show when calculating distance to their prey. Her hands remained folded, but her breathing had changed, deeper, more controlled. Veterans in the audience recognized the look. They'd seen it in combat zones when soldiers prepared to engage the enemy. And what was her explanation? She claimed she was pursuing peace, but whose peace? Anderson Assad's peace, Putin's peace, or the kind of peace that comes when America stops standing up for human rights and democratic values. Hillary's voice had gained strength and conviction, fed by the absolute attention of the audience and the knowledge that millions were watching. This was the moment she'd been preparing for. The chance to definitively end Tulsi Gabbard's political rise and restore the Clinton legacy to its rightful place at the center of Democratic Party power. Since then, her positions have been remarkably consistent with Russian interests. Opposition to supporting Ukraine, criticism of NATO, skepticism about our intelligence community, and now somehow she's been nominated to lead that very same intelligence community that she's spent years undermining. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. In the control room, Sarah Chen was making rapid-fire decisions about camera angles, knowing that this segment would be replayed and analyzed for weeks. Liberal media outlets were already preparing their coverage. Hillary Clinton exposes Russian asset in intelligence community. I've served in the highest levels of government, Anderson. I've seen how foreign influence operations work. They don't always recruit people directly. Sometimes they just find useful idiots, people whose natural inclinations align with their interests. And sometimes Hillary paused for effect, her eyes fixed directly on Tulsi Gabbard. They find people who are more than happy to do their work for them. The accusation was clear even without explicitly stating it. Russian asset, useful idiot, traitor. The words echoed in the silence that followed. Democratic establishment figures were practically giddy with excitement. They'd waited years for someone to finally destroy Tulsi Gabbard, and Hillary Clinton, the master of political combat, was delivering exactly what they'd hoped for. Anderson Cooper, veteran of countless contentious interviews, found himself momentarily speechless. This had gone far beyond anything CNN had anticipated. He cleared his throat and turned toward Tulsi Gabbard. "Congresswoman Gabbard, those are very serious allegations. How do you respond?" What happened next would be remembered as one of the greatest moments in political television history. The camera captured something remarkable in that moment, a room full of people holding their collective breath. Political junkies, intelligence professionals, veterans, and ordinary citizens, all waiting to see how someone responds to being called a traitor on national television. The split in the audience was immediately visible. Democratic establishment clapping enthusiastically, DNC loyalists nodding approvingly, Clinton Foundation donors smiling with satisfaction, former Obama officials exchanging congratulatory glances, liberal professors applauding Hillary's courage. But scattered throughout the audience, a different reaction was building. Veterans looking uncomfortable, military families shifting uneasily, intelligence professionals frowning at the politicization of their agencies, independent voters appearing shocked at the viciousness of the attack. On social media, the reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Democratic operatives and liberal celebrities were celebrating, "Finally someone said it," how our Russian asset, Alyssa Milano. Hillary speaking truth to power. "This is leadership," Rob Reiner. Tulsi Gabbard exposed, Russian asset confirmed. Keith Olbermann. MSNBC producers were frantically texting their hosts. Rachel Maddow's team was already cutting clips. CNN's Jim Acosta was tweeting his support for Hillary's patriotic stance. The liberal media ecosystem was in full celebration mode. Blue checkmarks were amplifying the attack across every platform. Liberal influences were declaring victory before Tulsi had even responded. The Democratic establishment was certain they were witnessing the complete destruction of a political rival. But in Studio 7B, all attention focused on the woman in the charcoal gray suit who had just been accused of betraying her country. Tulsi Gabbard sat in perfect stillness for what felt like an eternity, but was actually only about 8 seconds. Her military training was evident in her posture, spine straight, shoulders squared, hands relaxed but ready. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and carried an edge that made even her strongest critics lean forward. "Thank you, Secretary Clinton." The words were simple, but something in her tone made the audience sit up straighter. This wasn't going to be a defensive response or an emotional outburst. This was something else entirely, something that would transform American political discourse forever. Democratic establishment figures began to shift uncomfortably. Hillary's confident expression began to waver slightly. She'd expected anger defensiveness, perhaps an emotional appeal about military service. She hadn't expected this measured, almost grateful response. "I appreciate you sharing your perspective tonight. The American people do deserve the truth about their leaders." A pause during which he looked directly at Hillary Clinton. "About all of their leaders." Veterans in the audience straightened in their seats. Intelligence professionals leaned forward with sudden interest. Independent voters sensed something significant was about to happen. "You're absolutely right that we should examine the record of anyone entrusted with our nation's intelligence. So let's do that, shall we? Let's examine both of our records and let the American people decide who they trust with their national security." The shift in the room's energy was palpable. What had started as Hillary Clinton's prosecution of Tulsi Gabbard was about to become something very different, and the Democratic establishment was about to get a lesson in the difference between political calculation and moral authority. Tulsi Gabbard's transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The composed congresswoman was gone, replaced by something harder, a combat veteran who'd found herself under fire and was preparing to return it with devastating interest. Secretary Clinton, you've raised important questions about judgment, about loyalty, about serving American interests versus foreign interests. These are exactly the kinds of questions the American people should ask about anyone in a position of trust. She stood up slowly, a movement that immediately changed the dynamics of the studio. Hillary Clinton remained seated, suddenly looking smaller in her chair. The audience fell completely silent, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. Democratic establishment figures who had been applauding moments before now looked uncertain. Liberal Twitter users paused their victory celebrations. MSNBC producers stopped cutting celebration clips. Something in Tulsi's demeanor suggested this wasn't going to go as planned. So let's start with judgment. Let's talk about your judgment when 4 Americans were under attack in Benghazi. The audience audibly inhaled. Everyone knew where this was going, but the directness of it was shocking. CNN's producers in the control room exchanged panicked glances. This was already beyond anything they'd anticipated, and it was clear they were only getting started. Hillary Clinton's practiced composure began to crack. The confident political operator who'd just delivered what she thought was a knockout punch suddenly found herself in unfamiliar territory, being held accountable by someone who understood the real cost of failed leadership. Democratic audience members stopped applauding. Obama alumni looked uncomfortable. Clinton Foundation donors shifted nervously. The liberal media ecosystem's celebration began to stall as they realized their champion might be in trouble. September 11, 2012, Ambassador Chris Stevens, Information Management Officer Sean Smith, and CIA contractors Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods were killed in a terrorist attack in Libya. An attack that lasted over 8 hours while American forces waited for orders that never came. The names of the dead Americans hung in the air like an indictment. Tulsi's voice remained level, but each word was delivered with the precision of someone who understood that these weren't just political talking points. They were human beings who died because of failed leadership. Hillary Clinton tried to interrupt. That's been thoroughly investigated. Yes, it has been investigated, Tulsi continued without pause. And we learned some very interesting things. We learned that you told your daughter Chelsea that night that it was a terrorist attack. You told the Egyptian Prime Minister it was a terrorist attack. But you told the American people and the families of the dead Americans that it was caused by an anti-Islamic video. The contrast was devastating. The methodical presentation of facts, the calm delivery, the moral authority of someone who'd actually served in combat zones, it was everything Hillary Clinton's political theater was not. Democratic establishment figures in the audience were beginning to look genuinely worried. Their champion was under attack and she wasn't fighting back effectively. Worse, the attack was based on documented facts that couldn't be spun away. Tulsi Gabbard moved closer to the center of the studio space, commanding the room with the kind of presence that comes from genuine conviction rather than political calculation. Let me tell you what I know about serving in dangerous places, Secretary Clinton. I know that when Americans are under fire overseas, they trust that their government will move heaven and earth to save them. I know that when families lose their loved ones in service to this country, they deserve the truth, not a politically convenient lie. Her voice carried the weight of personal experience, the authority of someone who'd been shot at in defense of American interests, rather than someone who'd merely read about it in briefings. Hillary Clinton was visibly uncomfortable now, shifting in her chair, her confident political mask beginning to slip. Democratic audience members who had been cheering her attack on Tulsi were now sitting in stunned silence. Liberal Twitter was beginning to panic. The celebration clips were being quietly deleted. MSNBC producers were frantically messaging their hosts about damage control. The Democratic establishment was watching their champion being systematically dismantled, and they had no idea how to stop it. When you appeared before Congress when the families of those dead Americans demanded answers, you said, "What difference at this point does it make?" Well, Secretary Clinton, I can tell you exactly what difference it makes. The camera caught Hillary Clinton's face at that moment. The flash of anger, the tightening around her eyes that revealed how deeply that particular wound still hurt. But this time there was something else. Fear. The fear of someone who realizes they've walked into an ambush. It makes a difference to Ambassador Stevens' family, who deserve to know why their son was left in a dangerous situation without adequate security despite multiple requests. It makes a difference to Sean Smith's family, who deserve to know why the consulate wasn't protected. It makes a difference to the families of Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods, who deserve to know why no rescue was attempted during an 8-hour firefight. Veterans in the audience were nodding. Gold Star families were visibly moved. Even some Democratic audience members were beginning to see Hillary Clinton in a new light, not as a champion of progressive values, but as a politician who had callously dismissed the deaths of Americans who died under her watch. But most importantly, Secretary Clinton, it makes a difference to every American serving overseas right now who need to know that if they come under attack, their government will tell the truth about what happened. They need to know they won't be sacrificed for political convenience. The silence in the studio was complete. Even Anderson Cooper, veteran of countless political confrontations, seemed uncertain how to regain control of his own program. The devastating personal testimony that followed would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in political television. I've held the hands of dying soldiers. Secretary Clinton, I've written letters to their families. I know what honor means. What you did to those Benghazi families, lying to them while their sons' bodies were still warm, that's not politics, that's betrayal. Democratic establishment figures were openly cringing. Former Clinton staffers in the audience were looking down in embarrassment. Liberal media personalities were beginning to understand that their champion wasn't just losing this exchange, she was being destroyed. Without waiting for a response, Tulsi Gabbard shifted to her next line of attack. The methodical destruction of Hillary Clinton's credibility was accelerating, and the Democratic establishment could only watch in horror. But let's talk about something else, Secretary Clinton. Let's talk about national security and classified information. You've questioned my fitness to handle America's secrets, so let's examine your record with America's secrets. Hillary Clinton finally found her voice, but it came out weaker than before. Congresswoman, that's been investigated. Yes, I know. Yes. By FBI Director James Comey, who concluded that you were extremely careless in your handling of classified information. The phrase hit like a sledgehammer. Every person in America who'd followed the 2016 election knew those words, knew their significance. But hearing them delivered with such calm authority in this context gave them new, devastating power. Democratic audience members were no longer applauding. Obama alumni were looking uncomfortable. Clinton Foundation donors were beginning to distance themselves physically from their former champion. The liberal media ecosystem was in full panic mode. You stored classified information, including top-secret compartmented information, on a private email server in your basement, not secure government servers designed to protect national security information, your basement server. Tulsi began pacing slowly as she spoke, her movement adding kinetic energy to her words. Intelligence professionals in the audience were nodding approvingly. Finally, someone was taking the classification system seriously. When Congress issued a subpoena for your emails, 33,000 of them mysteriously disappeared. Your staff used specialized software called BleachBit to ensure they couldn't be recovered. When asked about it, you joked, "What, like with a cloth or something?" The callback to Hillary's dismissive comment during the investigation drew audible reactions from the audience. Some uncomfortable laughter from her supporters, sharp intakes of breath from others who were seeing the callousness clearly for the first time. Liberal Twitter had gone largely silent. The victory celebration had turned into a wake. MSNBC hosts were canceling their post-show Clinton praise segments. CNN's Jim Acosta had quietly deleted his supportive tweets. Secretary Clinton, you're sitting here questioning my fitness to handle classified information. But the FBI, the same FBI you now claim to respect so deeply, concluded that you were extremely careless with the most sensitive secrets our nation possesses. Hillary Clinton's face had gone pale. She was learning what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the kind of systematic demolition she'd spent years delivering to others. But this was different. This wasn't based on innuendo or political attacks. This was based on documented facts delivered by someone with unquestionable moral authority. As someone who has been nominated to lead our intelligence community, let me be clear about something: the protection of classified information is sacred. It's not about convenience, it's not about avoiding FOIA requests, it's not about hiding communications that might be politically embarrassing. Tulsi stopped pacing and faced Hillary directly, her voice rising with genuine conviction. It's about protecting sources and methods that keep Americans safe. It's about safeguarding intelligence that our allies trust us with. It's about ensuring that the enemies of this country don't gain access to information that could cost American lives. The weight of genuine conviction was evident in every word. This wasn't political theater. This was someone who understood at a visceral level what national security actually meant. You treated classified information like a personal convenience. The FBI director, your FBI director, said you were extremely careless, and now you have the audacity to question my commitment to protecting America's secrets. Tulsi Gabbard was far from finished. The systematic destruction of Hillary Clinton's credibility was entering its most devastating phase, and the Democratic establishment was about to witness the complete exposure of the corruption they'd spent years protecting and defending. But let's talk about something even more troubling, Secretary Clinton. You've accused me of being influenced by foreign governments. So let's examine your relationship with foreign governments, specifically the foreign governments that donated hundreds of millions of dollars to your family foundation while you served as Secretary of State. The Clinton Foundation. Even Hillary's most ardent supporters knew this was dangerous territory. The audience leaned forward, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Democratic establishment figures were visibly nervous now, knowing their entire political ecosystem was built around defending the indefensible. Between 2009 and 2013, your Clinton Foundation received over $145 million from individuals connected to Uranium One, a Canadian company that controlled 20% of America's uranium production capacity. During the exact same period, your State Department approved the sale of that company to Rosatom, the Russian Atomic Energy Agency. The facts landed like artillery shells, precise, devastating, and impossible to deflect. Liberal audience members were shifting uncomfortably. Former Obama officials were looking down at their phones. Clinton Foundation donors were beginning to understand they'd been played for fools. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Secretary Clinton. Russian interests wanted to acquire control of American uranium. Your foundation received $145 million from people involved in that deal. Your State Department approved the sale, and your husband, former President Clinton, received $500,000 for a single speech in Moscow from a Russian investment bank that was promoting Uranium One stock. Hillary Clinton tried desperately to interrupt. That's been debunked. Has it? Tulsi's response was swift and cutting. You were one of 9 officials who had to approve that sale. You could have blocked it. You chose not to. And coincidentally, during the exact same time period, your family foundation was receiving massive donations from the very people who would profit from that sale. The mathematical precision of it was undeniable. The timing, the amounts, the approvals, it all painted a picture that was impossible to explain away. Democratic establishment figures were realizing that their champion had just been exposed as everything they'd accused their opponents of being. But Tulsi wasn't done. She had more Clinton Foundation corruption to expose. Algeria contributed $500,000 to your foundation while you were Secretary of State, in direct violation of your agreement with the White House to disclose such donations. Qatar, which you yourself have called a state sponsor of terrorism, donated over $1 million. Saudi Arabia, which treats women as property and executes dissidents, contributed between $10 and $25 million. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. The audience was completely absorbed, watching the systematic destruction of a political icon in real time. Let's talk about Haiti Secretary Clinton. After the devastating 2010 earthquake, your foundation raised $13 billion for earthquake relief. How much of that money actually reached the Haitian people? How much went to companies connected to Clinton Foundation donors today? A decade later, Haitians are still living in poverty while your foundation's donors got rich off their suffering. Several audience members, including some Democrats, began to applaud. The moral clarity was undeniable. This wasn't partisan politics. This was a reckoning with corruption that had infected American government for decades. These weren't charitable donations, Secretary Clinton. These were investments. Investments in access. Investments in influence. Investments in a Secretary of State who could be bought. The devastating comparison that followed would be replayed millions of times. You call me a Russian asset? You literally approved giving Russia control of American uranium while your foundation received millions from the deal's beneficiaries. When Russian oligarchs wanted American uranium, they knew exactly who to pay, and it wasn't me. The audience erupted. Veterans were standing and applauding. Intelligence professionals were nodding approvingly. Even some Democratic audience members were clapping finally, understanding the scale of the corruption they'd been defending. Hillary Clinton sat frozen, her political career dying in real time on national television. Tulsi Gabbard wasn't just dismantling Hillary Clinton's specific attacks, she was exposing a decades-long pattern of behavior that went to the heart of character and fitness for public office. The Democratic establishment was about to be educated about the true nature of their champion. But there's something else the American people need to understand about you, Secretary Clinton. Something that goes beyond any single scandal or controversy. There's a pattern here, a consistent pattern of deception, deflection, and blame shifting that spans your entire career. She began ticking off examples with the systematic precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument that would send the defendant to prison for life. Monica Lewinsky, when your husband was exposed as a sexual predator who abused his position of power to exploit a 22-year-old intern, what was your response? Did you show concern for the young woman who was victimized? Did you demand accountability? No. You declared it was all part of a vast right-wing conspiracy. The reference to Hillary's most famous deflection drew murmurs from the audience. Everyone knew the phrase, but hearing it in this context, as part of a larger pattern of denying accountability, gave it new significance. Democratic audience members were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Their champion wasn't just losing this debate, she was being exposed as someone who had systematically protected sexual predators and attacked their victims. Paula Jones, Jennifer Flowers, Kathleen Willey, Juanita Broderick, when woman after woman came forward to describe sexual assault and harassment by your husband, you led the campaign to destroy their credibility. You called them bimbos. You hired private investigators to dig up dirt on them. You turned the victims into the villains. Hillary Clinton's face had gone ashen. These were wounds that had never fully healed, accusations that had followed her for decades. But this time there was no friendly media to deflect for her, no partisan audience to cheer her deflections. The Rose Law Firm records that mysteriously disappeared and then reappeared in the White House residence 2 years after they were subpoenaed. Whitewater. The firing of the White House travel staff so you could give the contracts to your friends. The mysterious suicide of Vince Foster, your law partner and close friend, whose office was cleaned out before investigators could examine it. Each item was delivered with clinical detachment, but the cumulative effect was devastating. The pattern was clear, undeniable, and completely damning. The email server scandal. When you were caught illegally storing classified information on a private server, what was your explanation? James Comey was biased. The Russians interfered. Misogyny. Everyone was to blame except Hillary Clinton. Liberal Twitter had gone completely silent. The Democratic establishment was watching 30 years of carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time. Even Anderson Cooper seemed reluctant to break the spell of Tulsi's systematic demolition. And when you lost the 2016 election, an election you were supposed to win easily against the most unpopular candidate in modern history, who did you blame? Russia? James Comey? Bernie Sanders? Jill Stein? The media? Misogyny? The Electoral College? Everyone except the candidate who ran such an incompetent campaign that she lost to Donald Trump. The silence in the studio was deafening. The Democratic Party's civil war was about to begin live on national television. Secretary Clinton, in your entire career, spanning 4 decades in public life, can you name a single time when something went wrong and you took responsibility? A single time when you said, "This was my fault and I'm sorry"? The question hung in the air like a challenge that everyone knew Hillary Clinton couldn't answer. The Democratic establishment was about to watch their champion's complete and final destruction. Hillary Clinton had built her career on her ability to survive political attacks. She'd weathered decades of scandals, investigations, and accusations through a combination of deflection, counterattack, and sheer force of will. But this was different. This wasn't a partisan hit job or media speculation. This was a systematic, fact-based destruction of her credibility delivered by someone who clearly understood political combat. For the first time in her political career, Hillary Clinton looked genuinely desperate. Her carefully composed expression had completely cracked, revealing something raw and panicked beneath the political veneer. "Congresswoman Gabbard." She began, her voice trembling with a combination of rage and fear. "You're engaging in exactly the kind of character assassination that—" "Character assassination?" Tulsi interrupted, something dangerous flashing in her eyes. "I haven't assassinated anything, Secretary Clinton. I've simply stated facts, documented facts, facts that are part of the public record." Democratic audience members were openly cringing at Hillary's performance. Obama alumni were visibly uncomfortable. Clinton Foundation donors were beginning to understand they'd been supporting a fraud. Liberal Twitter was in full panic mode, with many simply going silent rather than trying to defend the indefensible. "You're taking things out of context. What context makes it acceptable to lie to the families of dead Americans? What context makes it acceptable to store classified information on a private server? What context makes it acceptable to take millions from foreign governments while serving as Secretary of State?" Hillary Clinton was spiraling completely. The controlled, statesman-like persona she'd maintained for decades was collapsing under the weight of Tulsi's relentless prosecution. MSNBC producers were frantically messaging their hosts about damage control. CNN's Anderson Cooper was struggling to maintain even the appearance of neutrality. "You don't understand the complexities." "I don't understand." Tulsi's voice rose with righteous fury that resonated through every corner of the studio. "Secretary Clinton, I've served in combat zones while you collected $225,000 speaking fees from Wall Street banks that caused the 2008 financial crisis. The contrast was devastating. Real service versus personal enrichment, sacrifice versus greed, honor versus corruption. I've seen American soldiers die because of intelligence failures while you were approving uranium sales to Russia for foundation donations. I've risked my life for American interests while you were serving yourself." Democratic establishment figures were watching their entire political ecosystem crumble. Progressive audience members were cheering for Tulsi. Even longtime Democratic voters were beginning to see their party's corruption clearly for the first time. Real-time polling showed a massive swing toward Tulsi. Social media engagement was overwhelmingly supportive of her truth-telling. The Democratic Party's civil war was erupting live on television. Hillary Clinton's composure finally shattered completely. "How dare you!" she snapped, her voice carrying decades of frustrated entitlement and rage. "I've served this country for 40 years. I've broken barriers. I've fought for women and children, and you've served yourself for 40 years. Tulsi shot back, her military bearing, giving way to righteous fury that resonated with millions of Americans who'd been waiting decades for someone to finally speak truth to corrupt power. "Every position you've held, every office you've sought, every decision you've made has been calculated to benefit Hillary Clinton first and America second." The audience was transfixed. This had gone beyond political theater into something primal and real, a reckoning between authentic service and calculated corruption. Democratic establishment figures were openly embarrassed by their champion. Liberal professors were nodding in agreement with Tulsi's moral clarity. Young progressives were cheering against their own party's icon. Bernie Sanders supporters in the audience were finally getting their revenge for years of being called Russian assets. You talk about breaking barriers. The biggest barrier you've broken is the one between public service and personal enrichment. You and your husband left the White House dead broke, your words, and somehow accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars while you held public office. How does that happen, Secretary Clinton? The standing ovation that began at that moment would be remembered as the moment the Democratic Party started to free itself from Clinton corruption. It started with veterans spread to intelligence professionals, included progressive voters, and even reached some longtime Democratic establishment figures who were finally seeing clearly. Hillary Clinton was openly desperate now, her political mask completely gone. "You're nothing but a—" "But what?" Tulsi challenged with devastating effectiveness. "A Russian asset." That's your answer to everything, isn't it? Anyone who disagrees with you, anyone who calls out your corruption, anyone who threatens your power, they're all Russian assets. The Democratic Party's dirty laundry was being exposed on live television. Bernie Sanders was a Russian asset for challenging your coronation in 2016. Jill Stein was a Russian asset for running against you. Any Democrat who refused to bow down to your sense of entitlement became a Russian asset. You've destroyed the Democratic Party with this poison. And she took a step closer to Hillary Clinton, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more force than her previous shouting. "I swore an oath to defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I've kept that oath in uniform, and I'll keep it as Director of National Intelligence. But you've spent your entire career serving one master, your own ambition." The complete breakdown of Democratic Party unity was happening in real time. Progressive audience members were standing and applauding. Obama loyalists were distancing themselves visually from Clinton. Even Nancy Pelosi supporters in the audience looked disgusted by what they were witnessing. Anderson Cooper, who had lost control of his program long ago, finally found his voice. "Ladies, I think we need to—" "No, Anderson," Tulsi said without taking her eyes off Hillary Clinton. "The secretary has made serious accusations about my loyalty and my fitness for office. The American people deserve to hear her defend her own record." She addressed Hillary directly, her voice calm again, but carrying unmistakable authority. "Secretary Clinton, you've accused me of being a Russian asset based on nothing more than political disagreement. You've questioned my loyalty based on my military service and my constitutional oath. So let me ask you directly. Do you believe that everyone who disagrees with your foreign policy is a traitor?" Hillary Clinton seemed to shrink in her chair. The question was simple, but answering it honestly would expose the bankruptcy of her entire attack and the toxic legacy she'd brought to the Democratic Party. "That's not what I—" "It's exactly what you said. You called me a Russian asset because I met with Assad to pursue peace negotiations. You called Jill Stein a Russian asset because she ran against you for president. You've called Bernie Sanders and his supporters Russian assets because they had the audacity to challenge your coronation in 2016. Tulsi's voice grew stronger with each accusation, and the audience was responding with increasing enthusiasm. "Anyone who questions Hillary Clinton's judgment becomes a Russian asset. Anyone who points out Hillary Clinton's failures becomes a Russian asset. Anyone who refuses to bow down to Hillary Clinton's sense of entitlement becomes a Russian asset." She paused, looking directly into the camera, speaking to the millions of Americans who had been labeled and dismissed by the Clinton political machine. "The American people are tired of this, Secretary Clinton. They're tired of being told that everyone who disagrees with the Washington establishment is a traitor. They're tired of politicians who see public service as a path to personal enrichment. They're tired of leaders who never take responsibility for their failures." Hillary Clinton made one last desperate attempt to regain control, her voice cracking with desperation. "I've apologized for my mistakes. Name one." Tulsi challenged immediately, her response so quick it was clear she'd been waiting for this moment. The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like an eternity. The entire audience, Democratic establishment, progressive voters, veterans, intelligence professionals, and ordinary citizens, all waited for Hillary Clinton to name a single mistake she'd taken full responsibility for. "Just one, Secretary Clinton." Name one mistake you've taken full responsibility for without blaming someone else. Hillary Clinton opened her mouth and closed it. Her political career was ending on live television, and she couldn't even articulate a single moment of genuine accountability in 4 decades of public life. The challenge was simple, but everyone in the studio, and millions watching at home, knew she couldn't answer it. The Democratic Party's reckoning with corruption was complete. The transformation in Studio 7B was complete and historic. What had begun as Hillary Clinton's calculated political assassination of a rival had become her own public execution and the Democratic Party's liberation from decades of corruption. Hillary's supporters were sitting in stunned silence, unable to defend their champion's performance. The carefully curated collection of Democratic establishment figures who had come to witness Tulsi's destruction instead found themselves witnesses to their own ideology's collapse. Veterans were leading a standing ovation that spread like wildfire through the audience. Progressive voters were applauding against their own party's former standard-bearer. Young Democrats were cheering for authentic leadership over political calculation. Even longtime Democratic establishment figures were joining the applause, finally freed to acknowledge what they'd known for years but been afraid to say. The chanting began organically from the military veterans in the audience. Truth, truth, truth. It was picked up by progressive voters who had been dismissed as Russian assets for supporting Bernie Sanders. Intelligence professionals joined in celebrating someone who actually understood the sacred nature of their work. Finally, someone said it came from multiple sections of the audience. Drain the swamp, Bazikisin was heard even from some Democrats who recognized that their party needed cleansing from Clinton corruption. Anderson Cooper had completely lost control of his program, but it no longer mattered. This wasn't a television show anymore. It was a historic moment when the American people witnessed the complete exposure of political corruption and chose truth over narrative. Social media was experiencing a historic meltdown of the Democratic establishment. #Clinton destroyed was trending above #Russian asset. Liberal celebrities were frantically deleting pro-Hillary tweets. Democratic operatives had gone completely radio silent. MSNBC hosts were canceling their planned pro-Clinton segments. CNN's Jim Acosta had backtracked his Hillary support entirely. The real-time collapse of the Clinton-era Democratic Party was visible across every platform. Even longtime party loyalists were expressing shock at what they'd witnessed and admiration for Tulsi's courage in speaking truth to corrupt power. Hillary Clinton's humiliating exit became the defining image of the evening. She rushed toward the studio exit without making any statement. Her Secret Service detail creating a barrier between her and an audience that was no longer friendly. Former supporters refused to make eye contact. Clinton Foundation donors were visibly shaking their heads in disgust. The complete abandonment by the Democratic establishment was immediate and total. When the applause finally died down, Tulsi Gabbard addressed not just the studio audience or the television viewers, but the millions of Americans who had been waiting for someone to finally speak truth about the corruption that had infected their government. I didn't come here tonight to attack anyone. I came here to discuss my qualifications to serve as Director of National Intelligence and my vision for reforming our intelligence community. Her voice was calm again, presidential in its measured authority, but now carried the moral weight of someone who had just proven her courage under the most intense political fire. But when someone attacks my loyalty, when someone questions my commitment to this country, when someone calls me a traitor based on nothing more than political disagreement, I will respond with the truth. She gestured towards the empty chair where Hillary Clinton had been sitting. What you've witnessed tonight is exactly what's wrong with the Democratic Party, a party I once belonged to, a party that has been hijacked by corrupt elites who see public service as personal enrichment rather than sacred service. Democratic audience members were nodding enthusiastically. This wasn't an attack on democratic values. It was a call for the party to return to its authentic principles. Too many Democratic leaders have forgotten they serve the people, not themselves. Too many have chosen Wall Street donors over working families. Too many have chosen foreign money over American interests. Too many have chosen party loyalty over truth. The progressive response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Young Democrats were nodding enthusiastically. Working-class Democratic voters were feeling vindicated. Bernie Sanders supporters were finally getting their long-awaited acknowledgement. The Democratic Party can be redeemed, but only if it returns to serving working families instead of Wall Street banks, only if it chooses transparency over corruption, only if it puts America first instead of donors first. Even moderate Democrats were appreciating the honesty and moral clarity. This was what authentic Democratic leadership looked like. This is what real Democratic values look like: standing up to power, fighting corruption, telling the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Hillary Clinton represented everything the Democratic Party should reject. The ultimate vindication that followed would reshape American politics. If I am confirmed as Director of National Intelligence, I will bring that same commitment to truth and accountability to our intelligence community. No more politicization, no more leaks designed to damage political opponents, no more intelligence assessments shaped by political convenience. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the conviction of someone who'd found her moment and risen to meet it. Our intelligence professionals are among the finest people in government. They risk their lives to protect this country. They deserve leadership that respects their service and their sacrifice. They deserve leadership that puts America's interests ahead of political calculation. The standing ovation that followed lasted for over 3 minutes and marked the beginning of a new era in American politics. Hillary Clinton's retreat from the studio became a metaphor for the end of an entire era of Democratic politics. The woman who had dominated her party for 3 decades left without speaking to reporters, visibly shaken, abandoned by the establishment that had propped her up for so long. The contrast with Tulsi Gabbard couldn't have been more stark. The nominee stayed for over an hour, shaking hands with audience members, answering questions from reporters, and demonstrating the kind of accessible, authentic leadership that had been absent from Washington for decades. The Democratic Party's civil war had erupted in full view of the nation. Bernie Sanders' wing was celebrating Clinton's downfall as vindication of everything they'd said for years. The progressive movement was finally free to move forward without the Clinton albatross. AOC and the squad were tweeting support for Tulsi's truth-telling. Young Democrats were demanding immediate party leadership changes. Obama alumni were quietly celebrating Clinton's exit from politics. The media establishment's damage control was failing spectacularly. CNN panels were unable to defend Hillary's performance. MSNBC ratings plummeted as viewers rejected pro-Clinton spin. Liberal journalists were forced to acknowledge Tulsi's documented facts. Social media influencers were switching sides in real time. Democratic donors were cutting off Clinton-affiliated organizations. Wall Street banks that had paid Hillary hundreds of thousands for speeches were quietly distancing themselves from any Clinton association. Hollywood elites were canceling Clinton support events. The Clinton Foundation was facing immediate investigations by multiple agencies. Most significantly, independent voters and former Democrats were expressing renewed faith in the possibility of authentic leadership. Voter registration websites crashed as people sought to engage with a political system that suddenly seemed capable of producing real leaders. "Congresswoman, do you have any regrets about how that exchange went?" asked a CNN correspondent during her post-show availability. "I regret that it was necessary," Tulsi replied. "But when someone questions your loyalty to your country, when they call you a traitor based on political disagreement, you have an obligation to set the record straight with facts and truth." The confirmation hearing that followed was less a proceeding than a coronation. Even Democratic senators who had planned to oppose Tulsi's nomination found themselves unable to align with Hillary Clinton's completely discredited attacks. Chuck Schumer was forced to praise Tulsi's commitment to transparency. Elizabeth Warren acknowledged her refreshing honesty. Even Nancy Pelosi was unable to oppose the confirmation after Hillary's complete collapse. The final vote was 89-11, with the no votes coming only from senators with direct financial ties to Clinton Foundation donors. Several Democratic senators explained their yes votes by referencing Tulsi's impressive performance under pressure and her demonstrated commitment to putting truth above politics. But the most significant impact was on the Democratic Party itself. The Clinton era was officially over, and the party was finally free to undergo the moral reckoning it had needed for decades. The Clinton political machine was completely dismantled. Corporate Democratic influence diminished rapidly. Progressive populist movements gained control of party apparatus. Wall Street's stranglehold on Democratic policy was broken. Authentic public servants began rising through party ranks. The Gabbard standard became shorthand for a new approach to public service. Transparency became a political requirement rather than suggestion. Personal enrichment while in office became immediately disqualifying. Foreign money influence was finally being seriously investigated. Military service gained respect over political connections. Truth-telling became the most powerful weapon in politics. 6 months later, Director Tulsi Gabbard delivered her first public report on the state of American intelligence. It was a model of transparency and accountability that restored public confidence in agencies that had been politicized for decades. She instituted regular public briefings, declassified historical documents that shed light on past failures, and created new oversight mechanisms to prevent the kind of political manipulation that had characterized previous administrations. 1 year after the CNN showdown, the transformation of American politics was complete and historic. What had begun as Hillary Clinton's attempt to destroy a political rival had become the catalyst for the most significant political reformation in modern American history. The Democratic Party had undergone a complete leadership overhaul. Clinton-era politicians had retired or been primaried out by progressive populists who ran on platforms of transparency and authentic public service. Wall Street influence in the Democratic Party had been eliminated. Working-class voters were returning to the party in record numbers. Hillary Clinton herself had retreated completely from public life. Speaking fees had dropped to near zero. The Clinton Foundation was under FBI investigation. Book deals had been canceled. The Netflix production deal had been terminated. Her political consulting career was definitively over. International allies were expressing renewed confidence in American intelligence and leadership. The Gabbard effect had restored faith in American institutions by demonstrating that truth and accountability were still possible in American politics. The complete vindication extended far beyond politics. Monica Lewinsky was publicly thanked for her courage in speaking out against abuse of power. The Benghazi families finally received the justice and truth they deserved. Bernie Sanders supporters were vindicated after years of being dismissed as Russian assets. The progressive movement was no longer constrained by Clinton corruption. The American people were finally freed from a political dynasty that had prioritized personal enrichment over public service. Most importantly, the showdown had demonstrated that authentic leadership could still emerge in American politics. Military service, personal sacrifice, and moral courage had triumphed over political calculation, personal enrichment, and institutional corruption. The ultimate historical judgment would be simple but profound. The CNN showdown of 2025 didn't just end Hillary Clinton's career, it saved the Democratic Party from itself. By exposing the corruption that had poisoned American politics for decades, Tulsi Gabbard didn't just win a confirmation hearing, she won back the soul of American democracy. Young Americans who had grown cynical about politics were engaging with the system again. Voter turnout in subsequent elections reached historic highs. Public trust in government institutions was restored. The possibility of authentic leadership had been demonstrated, and the American people responded with renewed civic engagement. The naked truth, as it turned out, was more powerful than any political calculation, any media narrative, any institutional protection. And on that February night in 2025, America got to see what happened when someone finally had the courage to speak it. Completely devastatingly and with the moral authority that only comes from genuine service to others. The Clinton era was over, the age of authentic leadership had begun, and democracy had won.